In this video, we're going to have a message on why do the righteous suffer, which is a summary of the message of the book of Job. It's been a rather tough time for me and my wife. My wife's father died recently. Our beloved pet dog, Gracie, died shortly thereafter. There's a miscarriage in the family. There's serious depression in the family. There's neurological problems with a member of the family. There's all kinds of issues that are going on. And what about you? How is your life going? Have you lost a job? Has a loved one died? Has a relationship gone south? And more generally, why is it that good people suffer? The book of Job can be outlined as follows. You have the prologue, where the prologue is going to tell us that the reason why Job suffers is as a test of his faith. Then there's the dialogue between Job and three of his friends, where the friends are going to argue that Job suffers as a result of sin. Elihu, another friend, is going to argue a slightly different tact. He's going to say that Job's suffering is used by God to teach and to mold character. And then God will give his answer to Job, and the emphasis there will be on having faith in the light of suffering. So one way to look at the book of Job is to see it as addressing the question of why the righteous suffer. Or to put it differently, the theme of Job is the struggle to maintain integrity and faith in the face of suffering. So let's move to the beginning of the story, the answer of the prologue that Job suffers as a test of faith. Job is introduced in chapter 1 and verse 2. He was a blessed man with wealth and a large family. Verse 2 says he had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the east. So that would be east of Israel. It goes on to say in verse 17 that he was a blameless and upright man. That's what God says about him. We see that in that he prays and offers sacrifice for his children, just in case any of them have sinned, chapter 1 and verse 5. And God himself testifies that Job is as good a person as they come. It is thus clear that his suffering will not be because he is an especially bad person, despite what his friends may say. But then Satan comes and proposes to God to test Job's faith. Satan, whose name means the accuser, appears among the angelic sons of God in chapter 1, and this suggests that Satan is an angel. And he expresses skepticism that Job is really as good a person as God says he is. And he proposes that God test Job. And ultimately, Job is tested in 2 ways. One, his family and wealth are taken away. And then 2, his health is taken away. His family die in a storm wind that blows down their house on him. And then marauders come and take away his wealth. And the interesting thing is that Job seems to pass this initial test. The events in Job's life leave him impoverished, leaves him stricken by boils and sores, so that he has to use a piece of broken pottery to scrape the pus from his skin. But despite these heartbreaking conditions, Job maintains his faith. He doesn't blame God, but rather he praises God. He says, for example, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. And Job even rebukes his wife, who tells him to curse God and die in chapter 2 and verse 9. But Job responds, "You're talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" And despite Job's suffering, he does not sin by blaming God. Now, the prologue tells us then that Job suffers as a test of his faith. And does God still allow suffering to test people's faith today, as he did with Job and as he did with Abraham back in Genesis 22? I think there's no reason to doubt that he still tests people. He tested Job, he tested Abraham, he tested Israel, even tempts, the Father tempts Jesus by allowing Satan to tempt him in the wilderness in the Gospels. Testing our faith can be a good thing, whether or not we pass the test. If we pass the test of faith, well, then we have a testimony before others. If we fail to pass the test of faith, well, then we learn where we need to grow. If our faith is a house of cards that gets knocked down by the test, well, we see there where we can shore things up. Football player Teddy Bridgewater put it rather well after a rather devastating knee injury. He said, in order to have a testimony, you have to have a test. And perhaps even we today are suffering as a test of our faith in some sort. Well, let's move on to chapter 3, where Job then curses the day of his birth. Now, at the end of chapter 2, 3 friends of Job come to comfort him, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And they remain there in silence for 7 days. But then Job breaks the silence by cursing the day of his birth. Why is light given to those in misery, and life to the bitter of soul, to those who long for death that does not come, who search for it more than hidden treasure, who are filled with gladness and rejoice when they reach the grave? Why is life given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For sighings come to me instead of food. My groans pour out to me like water. What I feared has come upon me. What I dreaded has happened to me. I have no peace, no quietness. I have no rest, but only turmoil. The speech of Job raises 2 questions. Has Job lost his faith? He seems now in verse 23 to be blaming God, whom God has hedged in, is what he says. And related to that, will it be that Satan, rather than God, will have been proven right after all? Well, this brings us to Job's friends' answer to why Job has suffered. Now, Job's 3 friends essentially have the same answer as to why Job suffers. He suffers because he has sinned in some terrible way. For example, Eliphaz, chapter 4, says, he approaches it kind of politely. If someone ventures a word with you, will you be impatient? But who can keep from speaking? Think how you have instructed many, how you have strengthened feeble hands. Your words have supported those who stumbled. You have strengthened faltering knees. But now trouble comes to you and you're discouraged. It strikes you and you're dismayed. Should not your piety be your confidence and your blameless ways your hope? Now he gets to the point. Consider now, who being innocent has ever perished? Where are the upright ever destroyed? As I have observed, those who plow evil and those who sow trouble reap it. In other words, Job, you must have plowed evil. You must have sown trouble. You must not be innocent. You have sinned. Bildad also comes up with the same answer. Not only Job have you sinned, but your children must have sinned too. So, for example, in verse 1, then Bildad the Shuhite, by the way, you've heard that Bildad is reputedly the shortest man in the Bible because he was Shuhite. When Bildad the Shuhite replied, how long will you say such things? Your words are a blustering wind. You see, Job in the meantime has denied that he has sinned in the portion of the text that we've skipped. Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? When your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. So not only have you sinned, Job, that you are suffering so greatly, but your children must have sinned too, that he allowed that storm wind to blow over the house and killed them all when they were all together for a big meal. And then the third friend, Zophar, comes up with a similar answer. Not only have you sinned, but God could have punished you even more because he forgets some of your sin. Then Zophar, the Naamathite, replied, are all these words to go unanswered? Again, Job has denied the accusations in the dialogue that we're skipping. Is this talker to be vindicated? Will your idle talk reduce men to silence? Will no one rebuke you when you mock, when you say to God, my beliefs are flawless and I am pure in your sight? Oh, how I wish that God would speak, that he would open his lips against you and disclose to you the secrets of wisdom, for true wisdom has two sides. Know that God even has forgotten some of your sin. Now, Job's fundamental problem is that he agrees with his friends' simplistic theology that the righteous are blessed and the wicked suffer. But he cannot accept their accusations that he must have committed some sort of terrible sin, and that's why God is punishing him, because he knows from experience that this is not his problem. And consequently, Job in his speeches cries out to God, crying out that God has been unfair, and he longs for some sort of mediator who could stand between him and God so that he could argue with God that his suffering is some sort of mistake, that he doesn't deserve the suffering that he has. As he says in chapter 7 and verse 20, if I have sinned, what have I done to you, O watcher of men? Why have you made me your target? You're punishing me for things I haven't done. I haven't done anything, and yet you are shooting me like arrows into a target. Chapter 9 and verse 17. He says, for he bruises me without cause. God has been unfair. He's punishing him for things he hasn't done. And he longs that God would come down and talk to him. If only there were someone to arbitrate between us, to lay his hand upon us both. Maybe if there was a mediator that could come between me and God, that we could haggle this thing out, and I could explain why you've got something wrong here, that you're punishing me for things that I didn't do. And then he longs to argue with God. Chapter 10, verse 15 and 16. Even if I am innocent, I cannot lift my head. God would knock it off if he lifts up his head. If I hold my head high, you stalk me like a lion. He wishes to argue with God, but he is afraid to. Now, Job and his friends will argue along these lines all the way through chapter 31 of the book of Job without resolving the matter. The friends keep saying, Job, you have sinned. Job, keeps saying, no, I haven't, and God is unfair, and things along those lines. And so what are we to make of this particular discussion? What are we to make of the answer of Job's friends? Well, Job's friends are correct for some people. That is, it is true that some people do bring disaster upon themselves by their own bad behavior. If you commit crimes, you may be punished by the authorities. If you commit certain sins, there may be natural consequences for those sins. For example, if you abuse your body with alcoholism and drugs, there's often a negative result physically. Those who drive recklessly may kill themselves and others in the process. And so we can't rule out that sometimes even today, God allows us to suffer as a consequence of our own mistakes and bad behavior. But what we can say is that Job's friends are completely wrong in the case of Job. For after all, it was God himself who said of Job that Job is a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil. And surely God is not wrong. And yet Job suffers despite his righteousness. Now, from Job, we learn that it is foolish and wrong to accuse someone who is suffering of having hidden sins that led God to punish him and her. For even the best of people, people like Job, may suffer terribly. Well, now we move on to the answer of yet another friend. He shows up in chapter 32. His name is Elihu, the son of Barachel. And he is going to disagree both with Job and Job's friends and give the answer, which I would summarize as that suffering can be a means of revelation from God that can mold our characters. Now, the situation is that both Job and his friends have come to an impasse. Both think themselves right and the other wrong, and they were unable to convince each other of who was right. Well, Elihu comes along. So after it says these three men stopped answering Job because he was right in his own eyes, Elihu comes along and takes a third position. And this is what we know about Elihu. Again, he is answering both of them because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. Elihu is young. He's younger than the other friends and had kept silence during the debates. After all, a young man tends not to interrupt their elders. Also, Elihu is kind of wordy. When he begins speaking in chapter 32, he seems to be something of a windbag who takes a long time to wind up and get to his point. And he spends really the whole of chapter 32 just winding up. And even says at one point in verse 18, I'm full of words. And one is tempted to laugh at Elihu. Does he really have anything to say, or is he just another windbag? One almost despairs that he has anything new to contribute. But it does seem that he has new insights, and that doesn't show up until chapter 33. He gives a somewhat different explanation as to why Job suffers than the other friends. So in verse 33 and chapter 33 and verse 8, he says this: surely you have spoken in my hearing, and I have heard the sound of your words. I am pure, without transgression. I am innocent, and there's no guilt in me. Behold, he invents pretexts against me. He counts me as his enemy, speaking of God. He puts my feet in the stocks. He watches all my paths. Behold, I tell you, you're not right in this, for God is greater than man. He's not right in what? I think what he's not right in is what it says in verse 10, that God is inventing pretexts against Job to punish him. In other words, God is inventing non-existent sins as a basis for punishing Job so terribly. But that is not the reason why Job suffers, says Elihu, but rather there is a different reason. As he goes on, verse 13, chapter 33, why do you complain to him that he answers none of man's words? For God does speak, now one way, now another, though man may not perceive it, in a dream, in a vision of the night, when sleep falls on men as they slumber in their beds. He may speak in their ears and terrify them with warnings, to turn man from wrongdoing and to keep him from pride, to preserve his soul from the pit, his life from perishing by the sword. Or a man may be chastened on a bed of pain with constant distress in his bones. Now, this seems to be Elihu's answer. Just as God can speak in a dream or in a vision, God can also speak to us through pain, through suffering. In other words, pain can be a means of revelation from God. And in using pain, God can use a pain to warn us, just as when we touch a hot stove, the pain warns us to snap back. It can chasten us. It can humble our pride, as it says back in verse 17, to turn man from wrongdoing, to keep him from pride. Now, pain, in other words, can mold our character. Pain can be the divinely appointed means of molding our character so as to make us the type of people that God would like us to be. For example, pain causes us to pray. When we're in pain, we pray to God, 33 verse 26. That person prays to God and finds favor with him. He sees God's face and shouts for joy. He's restored by God to his righteous state. So pain causes us to pray and increases our righteousness. Pain causes us to change our direction, even those who are going generally in the right direction. When we begin to go wrong, lest something worse befall us, causes us to turn back his soul from the pit, that the light of life may shine on him. Even the best of men make mistakes, and sometimes that pain is useful in turning us away from such things. Indeed, there are certain benefits to suffering. Suffering, if rightly received, can make us tougher, can teach us to be sympathetic when we see others suffering the way we have suffered. Suffering can make us more pure. Suffering can increase our dependence on God. Suffering is necessary for certain types of greatness. A great athlete doesn't become a great athlete without suffering through lots of practice and training. Same thing is true of a great musician. And often we must suffer lots in practice and training, become really good at whatever it is that we do. Suffering is not all bad. And so Elihu's answer, different than Job's friend, is not that Job has sinned, but that suffering can be a means of God's revelation to mold our character. Well, now let me hasten on to the end of the story, where we come to God's answer to Job in chapter 38 to the end of the book. And in God's answer to Job, it turns out that as Elihu was speaking, a storm was approaching, but suddenly they realized that this was no ordinary storm, but rather it was God himself coming down to speak to Job, just as Job had requested all along. He had been asking God, come down and talk to me about this mistake that you've made in punishing me for sins that I have not committed. And so in chapter 38 and verse 1, then the Lord answered Job out of the storm, and he makes many points to Job. He points him to nature and says the following, who is this that darkens counsel without words, without knowledge, with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you will answer me. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched out a measuring line across it? On what were its footing sets? Or on who laid its cornerstone while the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Who shut up the sea behind the doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it and set doors and bars in place? When I said, thus far you may come and no farther. Here is where your proud waves halt. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place, that it might take the earth by the edges and shake the wicked out of it? Do you know the laws of the heavens? Can you set up God's dominion on the earth? Can you raise your voice to the clouds and cover yourself with a flood of water? Do you send the lightning bolts on their way? Do they report to you, we are here? God asked Job many, many difficult questions, questions that he would find impossible to answer as he looks at the vastness of creation. The only answer is either, I don't know, only you know, God, or you did it, God, I couldn't have done such a thing. And in doing all this, he's trying to show Job that he doesn't have the knowledge or the wisdom to question God's justice. And indeed, Job responds to this when confronted by God's greatness and wisdom as seen in creation. He's dumbfounded. Job wasn't there. God and only God had the power and wisdom to make the world as it is. And Job now sees that most of God's world is mysterious and unknown to him. And God has put Job in his place, in other words. And Job responds by answering the Lord, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. Now God moves on to a couple of illustrations from nature, namely two creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. And the point of Behemoth and Leviathan is to show that these two animals cannot be controlled by ordinary human beings. And in like manner, I, God, cannot be controlled. Now, I believe that Behemoth is, and there's some debate on this, but I think that Behemoth is to be identified with the hippopotamus, and Leviathan is to be identified with a crocodile. These are going to illustrate God's greatness and uncontrollability. Look at Behemoth, which I made along with you and which feeds on the grass like an ox. what strength he has in his loins, what power in the muscles of his belly. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs are rods of iron. He ranks first among the works of God. When the rivers rage, he is not alarmed, he is secure. Though the Jordan should surge against his mouth, can anyone capture him by the eyes or trap him and pierce his nose? And then he moves on to the other creature, Leviathan, chapter 41, verse 1. Can you pull up Leviathan with a fishhook and tie down his tongue with a rope? Can you put a cord through his nose and pierce a jaw with a hook? Will he keep begging to you for mercy? Will he speak to you with gentle words? No, probably bite your hand off. Will he make you an agreement with you so that you can take him as your slave for life? Can you make a pet of him like a bird, put him on a leash for your girls? It's absurd. If you lay a hand on him, you will remember the struggle and never do it again. What is the point that God is making with these two animals? Just as you cannot control Leviathan, Behemoth, just as you cannot tame Leviathan, neither can you control or tame me. Chapter 41 and verse 10. No one is fierce enough to rouse him, speaking of Leviathan. Who then is able to stand against me? The point of these illustrations is to say that God cannot be tamed or controlled. God tells Job, and through Job, he's telling us that we must let God be God. And that seems to be the point. God is in effect saying, I am God and you are man. You cannot make me a comfortable part of your theology. You cannot control me. You cannot win an argument with me. In calling on me to come down and debate you, Job, you are trying to control me. In saying that the whole structure of the universe is unjust, you're putting yourself in my place. Look at my might and my wisdom and nature. Realize how ignorant you are of my great and complex universe. And then how dare you say that I'm unjust? I don't fit into your theological boxes. I can be no more tamed and controlled than Behemoth and Leviathan. I'm not limited by men. I'm God. You are not. You see, we cannot win an argument with God. In saying to God that the whole structure of the universe was unjust, Job was putting himself in God's place. But we lack the wisdom to judge the justice of God. God is wiser than we are, and it's arrogant and wrong to claim that we have wisdom enough to judge God's justice. And so ultimately, we're left with just one thing. We can't control God. We can't win an argument with God. We must trust in God and his goodness. In the end, as Steinman puts it in his commentary on Job, God calls on Job to give up his questioning and return to his simple, trusting faith. And that is what Job does. And so Job repents in sackcloth and ashes. Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No plan of yours can be thwarted. You ask, who is this that obscures my counsel without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will speak, and I will question you, and you shall answer me. My ears have heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you, and therefore I despise myself and repent in sackcloth and ashes. You might raise the question, way back in chapter 3, did Job lose his faith? Well, I think it's fair to say that his faith may have been bent up a bit, but it never buckled and collapsed. And indeed, by the end of the story, Job emerges with a faith that is richer and deeper than it was before. And God goes on to bless him more than he had done before, with new wealth and a new beautiful family and a long life. Well, what about Job's friends? Well, God rebukes the three friends. After the Lord had said these things to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am angry with you and your two friends, because you have not spoken of me what is right as my servant Job has. So now take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourself. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. You have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. And so Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shuhite and Zophar the Naamathite did what the Lord told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. Now you might say, well, what about Elihu? He doesn't get mentioned in the end. Now, there are some that suggest that, well, he doesn't get mentioned in the end because he was rather insignificant. But I think the better answer is to say that Elihu is not rebuked at the end because he was not wrong. So far as his answer goes, Elihu's answer is a correct one. So how shall we conclude? It turns out that each of these sections of Job give partial explanations as to why people suffer. Sometimes we may suffer as a test of our faith, just as Job was tested by God through Satan in Job chapters 1 and 2. Sometimes we do suffer because of our own foolishness and sin, as Job's friends wrongly accused Job of. Sometimes God will allow us to suffer to mold our character and as a means of revelation. But then, what exactly was God's answer to Job? You see, God never actually tells Job why he suffered. We know because we can read the prologue, but Job never is told. You see, sometimes we suffer for reasons known only to God. We trust that he never allows any useless suffering, but that he has some good purpose behind our suffering, whatever that may be. But even when we don't know, in such cases, we must allow God to be God and trust that our suffering somehow fits into his wisdom and goodness. As we leave the question of why the innocent suffer, I would also just want to mention that the greatest case of innocent suffering is in our Lord Jesus Christ. He's the only truly innocent sufferer. I mean, Job, even though he was a blameless and upright man, he was as good as they came. He was still a sinner. Christ was not a sinner, but yet he suffered for us. As we reflect on Christ's suffering, I just leave with a quotation from George MacDonald, who is cited by C.S. Lewis in his famous book, The Problem of Pain, where he says that the Son of Man suffered unto death, not that men might not suffer, but that their suffering might be like his. That is the message of the book of Job as to why the righteous suffer. And my name is Dr. Joe Sprinkle.